I've decided that with all these new technologies, they still haven't really caught up with women in that if I put this on my dress, it just hangs rather awkwardly. And clearly my head is not big enough because the speaker thing keeps popping off my ear. So if I leap around too much, I might lose the microphone, but I'm sure you'll understand. First of all, I wanted to say thank you very much, Tusen tak, for inviting me here. For me it's a great privilege, and as Hildegunn said, I've got quite a few connections already with various university groups in Norway and Sweden and Denmark, so in some cases it's like coming back to old friends. And I just wanted to start with Exeter and bring you greetings from Exeter, and I've discovered it's the same in Norwegian and Danish. Am I correct? No, Google Translate thinks it is, which is back to the new technologies. I've decided I'm having a year of linguistic experiences because in February I went to Spain for a very small symposium of people interested in metalinguistic understanding, and there they were speaking Catalan, Valencian, Castilian Spanish, which is main Spanish, but you can't say that if you're in Spain, and Basque. And Basque is obviously totally different from the other three. And now here I am with Danish, Swedish and Norwegian, which for a poor English speaker seem remarkably alike. And I know they're not, but they are clearly related. So I'm having a really good linguistic experience trying to work out whether it's Danish, Swedish or Norwegian that I'm reading or listening to. But Exeter, I always put where Exeter is on the map because we don't have a football team. And apparently in the UK, people only know where places are, like Manchester and Liverpool, if they have football teams. We're a very small city in the southwest of England, but with a really good university that I'm part of. And it's a very old city, Roman city, so you can see that area there. Although sadly, since that photo was taken, one of the hotel has just burnt down in the summer. So it's being rebuilt, but it clearly won't be the same. And as Hildegunn said, I'm the director of the Centre for Research in Writing at Exeter, and there we're interested in all aspects of writing. So one strand of our research is on the grammar, but it isn't the only thing we look at. We've also got concurrently several research projects at the moment that are looking at creative writing, and particularly the way that professional writers, poets and novelists may be working with teachers in schools to support the teaching of writing on that side. So we're very much concerned with writing in its generality, not just about grammar. In England, I'm known as the grammar person, and it's not quite the name I really want. So coming to the grammar, one of the things that drives a lot of what we've been doing is very much around schools and learning and children, because the other side of my professional experience is working in teacher education and educating teachers of English for secondary schools. So I'm very interested in how do we support teachers in being more informed about how they are constructing being a teacher. And that question, why teach grammar, isn't one that's often answered. There's a lot of assumptions underpinning the thinking around why we should teach grammar, or indeed why we should not teach grammar. So probably the three dominant reasons that you might suggest for teaching grammar would be that if you could understand grammar, you can understand the structure of your own language, how your own language is shaped. And linked to that would be understanding the structure of languages that you're learning. One of the things that I noticed really quickly, having spent a couple of days in Copenhagen, is just how fast you can pick up nouns in a foreign language because so many things are signposted. What I know I don't get at all in Danish are which words are the verbs. And that might be where some of that explicit understanding of how the language works might help me. It could be that you think that learning grammar is to avoid errors, in other words, to increase accuracy and stop you from making mistakes in speaking and writing of your own language, and possibly other languages too, or to develop understanding about how texts make meaning, how texts work, and how you can make meaning through the choices that you make in texts. And I know that many, many European countries teach grammar routinely. So it's really important to know that in many Anglophone countries, including England, grammar has not been taught for about 50 years. It was abandoned. So that's why I say the why teach grammar, how you answer that, partly depends on the context that you come from. And so there is a research problem that surrounds this notion of grammar. And as I said here, in Anglophone countries, it was abandoned. There's a famous conference in 1966 in America called the Dartmouth Conference, which effectively came up with the idea that teaching grammar, and that was very much traditional grammar, was not actually helping children to be any better as language users, and therefore it had no value in the curriculum. And it was a very, very powerful conference because not just the USA, but also English-speaking Canada, all of the United Kingdom, Australia and New Zealand largely followed its, not its diktat, but its thinking, and those countries didn't really formally teach grammar at all. In England, it has just come back into the curriculum with a huge bang, because in the revision in 2014 gives it great prominence, including a national test of grammar at age 11. So for us, the context is shaping this quite heavily. And the principal arguments around abandoning grammar teaching were mostly about these. It doesn't make any difference to how good you are at reading and writing to be able to identify nouns and adjectives in a sentence. That grammar is fundamentally about error correction, and actually as language teachers we want to do far more than just teach children about not making errors. That they debate the idea that grammar is necessary for language proficiency when argue you don't need it. It's immersion and being a user. And then the idea that grammar and creativity are completely opposed. The idea that, and of course in the mid-60s was the big flourishing, certainly in Anglophone countries, of a huge emphasis on creativity in the language curriculum. And grammar and creativity were seen as diametrically opposed, largely because creativity was conceptualized as about freedom and grammar was conceptualized as about rules. So you get two oppositions. For us, it's really interesting, as I say, currently researching creative writing and working with professional writers who will talk endlessly about how to be a good writer means that you have to be disciplined, you have to be strict, you have to edit rigorously, and they make lots of references to grammar, although none of them say they use grammar, but they make lots and lots of references to grammar. And then perhaps one of the most famous quotes that's used by people who are keen to not teach grammar was by Peter Elbow in America, very much part of the creative writing movement, very pro-free writing, said nothing helps your writing so much as ignoring grammar. So that's the kind of context in which this is all occurring. And the real difficulty is that if you look a lot of the writing about this, very little of it is secure, robust research. A lot of it is informed by either ideology or polemic. So you get people ranting, and I mean ranting, about having grammar in the curriculum, and likewise people ranting about not having grammar in the curriculum. And so you don't get any, we haven't really had any history of real discussion about, well, what is the role? Is there a role, and what might it be? So that research, and I say it's a small body of research, it's not a strong body. What there are repeated studies, and when I say repeated, I mean 3 or 4, that show no evidence of impact on writing. So these are studies that have been heavily used by people who don't think we should teach grammar at all as firm evidence of why that we shouldn't. The difficulty with these studies is that in general, they investigated whether if children did a grammar course on Fridays and they did their normal language teaching, English in these cases, on Mondays, Tuesdays and Wednesdays, would it improve their writing? And they found no evidence that it did. Well, my argument would be, well, why would you think it would if you're not making any form of connection between the two? That was, of course, how my own teaching of grammar at school. I was in school, in a grammar school in England, so one of the few schools in England where you still did grammar, and I never connected the grammar that I learned having anything to do with my English lessons. I thought it was much more to do with the Latin that I did, but nothing to do with English. So there are no studies that have investigated whether if you teach grammar where the learning is focusing on the writing and you're introducing the grammar that's relevant to the writing, does that help children as language users? And significantly, of course, for me, working in a UK context, none of the studies that were cited were in the context of our own curriculum and our own national context. So we then did some research, and I'll show you in a future next slide, I think it is. We have shown that when you integrate grammar, reading and writing together, so they share a common instructional point, it is showing some very positive results. So we've got evidence that kind of is counter to, or complementary to, you could argue, what's gone before. So before I get to our studies, I just want to think about some theoretical perspectives, because this is the other thing, that when you look at the research on grammar, those studies, nobody has ever theorized a position on grammar or a position on why teaching grammar might have any learning links for language users. So first of all, it's just to draw out that prescriptivist, descriptivist distinction that linguists are familiar with, because in essence, that prescriptivist, descriptivist divide partly expresses some of that debate about whether grammar should be in or not. So the prescriptivist theory of grammar, of a grammar-writing relationship, emphasizes the notion of rule obedience, that there is a correct way to form things. There's a prescription of what language should look like, and our job as language educators is to make sure that children adhere to it. That is without doubt the view of our government, and that is the view that is behind the grammar in our curriculum at present. It's about accuracy. And of course, being accurate in grammar does not make you a good writer. It's necessary but not sufficient. And when I said this to our government assessment bodies who were designing the new grammar test, there was a kind of ripple of astonishment around the room to say, well, what do you mean it's not enough? And I said to you, any teacher will be able to tell you children whose writing is completely error-free, but really, really dull. And you know, the Plain English Society is often talking about that. It's not about error, it's about how effectively you communicate. But then the descriptivist theory is actually much more interested in how language is used in different contexts. So it's less interested in prescribing how it should be used and much more interested in exploring how it is used. And that, of course, opens up the possibilities of all the multiple ways that it's used in multiple contexts. So the way that grammar is used in speech compared to writing is very different. The way that grammar manifests itself in different types of genre are different. The way grammar operates in informal and formal contexts vary. So the descriptivist view is much more about understanding how language is being used to make meaning. So that's just the point that I made to our test setters, that accuracy in writing may be necessary, but it's not sufficient to generate good writers. And then thinking about the approach that we've been using, we've been taking very much of a Hallidayan perspective on grammar, where he talks a lot about grammar as meaning making. And what we're interested in is that the way you communicate your message is as important as the message itself. The meaning is constructed through the how and the what together. And the what on its own isn't always enough to communicate in the way that you want to. There are all sorts of links back to what Roher was talking about in his presentation earlier, because this links back to the idea of interpretive communities, that what you write is you've got a particular content, but as a writer, you have an authorial intention of who you're communicating with and what you want that writing to do for them. And that's where the how we write comes in. And you're writing for a particular interpretive community. Let's say Halliday talks a lot about learning how to mean, and grammar being central to being a resource for meaning making. So grammar isn't just an irrelevant technicality on the side, it is central to the process of both understanding and creating text. And Debra Myhil and Jones, who are two researchers in Australia who do a lot of work in schools. Halliday obviously is a linguistic theorist, but the Debra Myhil and Jones have done a lot of work transferring this into schools. And they draw that distinction that I'm trying to draw between not just seeing grammar as a set of structures that you have to be able to reproduce correctly to be a good writer, but actually seeing language as a resource that helps you to make meaning, and it helps to shape the way that you interact with your world and yourself. And then closer to home, to English grammar theorists, Ronald Carter and Tom McCarthy, they talk about grammar as choice. And so what he does is he distinguishes between grammar as structure, which is the way in which you look at how language works and label structures and give names to structures, and grammar as choice, which is all about how, as language users, we can understand the choices that we make and how they can subtly alter what we communicate. And so this is, again, Laura McKeachie in the US, really emphasizing that idea of the meaning-making relationship between the grammatical choices that we make and the meanings that we're trying to represent. This notion of it represents relationships between the writers and the world they live in. And that, things like word choice, sentence structure are not simply translations of ideas in your mind into words on paper, but they are recreations of what we want to express, and that we have to finally shape those to actually achieve the meanings that we want to create. Again, talking to our professional writers, they understand that 100%. One of the things that they talk about a lot is the amount of revision they have to do. And all of their revision is around this. It's about trying to make sure that what they're saying is saying what they want to say in the right way to communicate with their readers. So that notion of choice kind of underpins what I'm talking to you today about when I'm talking about repertoires of possibility. So Kellogg, a cognitive psychologist talking about writing, reminds us that writing is always an act of making decisions at every level. Not all of them linguistically. So, you're making a whole set of decisions about what information you're going to include. So here, if it was narrative, you might be thinking about storyline. If it's an argument piece, you're thinking about what are the points I'm going to make. You might be thinking about how you're going to entitle your piece, the structure and shape, what message you're trying to communicate, how you're going to phrase things, the words you use. And increasingly in our multimodal society, it's about what it looks like as well as the verbal communication. Fonts communicate, they're part of the social semiotic. That if you really want to be taken seriously academically, you choose certain fonts because they are known, they are part of that interpretive community. They are read more seriously. You wouldn't want it's Gothic, I think, on our keyboard, where it's got dripping blood coming out of the print. You wouldn't write an academic article in that because you wouldn't be taken seriously. So font choice is not just an accident or even your preference. It is about conveying meaning through fonts, and then layout, and that includes all the multimodality about the interrelationships between sound and image, and increasingly on screen, the various things that you can bring in, like video clips or audio, or the ways that people can be encouraged to navigate the screen of your writing. So our research has been focusing very much not on all of those choices. We recognise them as all important, but we're looking particularly at language choices. So that's our area. And looking at the decisions that writers make and helping writers to be more aware of the decisions they make. And for us, one of the things about emphasising that as a writer, there are a myriad of choices available to you every time you sit down to write a text is partly about trying to develop independence and autonomy in writers. Again, Roger talked about not Roger, sorry, it's because I read it as Roger. Institutional regimes of meaning making. I think for us in England, where we have a very high stakes assessment, the teaching of writing is heavily driven by institutional regimes where in many ways, children are told that in order to get such and such a mark, you need to do this, 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 and this. Whether it's actually true that you need to do this, this, and this, but that's certainly the way it's taught. And of course, then children don't know why they're doing it. They're just obeying. They're reproducing what the teachers have told them. They have no decision-making themselves other than remembering to recall what they've been told. And often there are checklists. So just as Roger showed you the World War I, or World War II, can't remember which one it was, set of things that you might need to remember as the causes of the war, our children will have checklists of what they must do, must get into their writing. So for us, this notion of choice is about independence and autonomy as writer. And of course that choice happens within parameters, because children have to understand the community that they're writing for and be able to switch for that community. But certainly the most able writers may well be able to break conventions of those communities in order to do something different, which is part of that power of being a writer. So we talk about the idea that when we're writing and when we're teaching with grammar in mind, we're talking about developing in young learners a repertoire of infinite possibility. And in some ways, our choice of language itself is a meaning-making choice, because we see it as directly counter to the general view of what grammar is, where that view of grammar is about obeying rules. We're saying it's not about obeying rules, it's actually about the possibilities that language offers you. So our own research that we've done at Exeter, we've done a cumulative series of studies, so it's not one study, and we've used multiple different paradigms or methodological approaches to the research. I should have said our centre is an interdisciplinary centre of writing, so we're very keen to draw on psychological, cognitive, socio-cultural and linguistic perspectives on writing. And likewise, our research approaches are equally multiple. So we've done large randomised controlled trials, qualitative longitudinal studies, so there's two extremes of, well, I don't know if they are two extremes, but often seen as two extremes. And what they show is evidence of positive impact on students and student attainment. What they also show is some of the downsides of not the downsides so much as what are the constraints and barriers to implementing this approach in the classroom, because we're very keen not to be seen as simply saying we have research which shows that this works, therefore you should go and do likewise. Again, we have a very strong culture at government level of a what works approach to education, which funds a lot of these randomised controlled trials in order to be able to say to teachers, this works, this is what you should be doing. And one of the biggest things that we see that in is in the teaching of phonics for early reading, which is it's the evidence-based approach to teaching of reading emphasises phonics, almost to the exclusion of all the other things that we know are important about the teaching of writing. So we're very keen to stress our position as researchers who want to understand something better, rather than politicians who are trying to prove a point. And so we theoretically, we feel that what we're doing is trying to develop explicit metalinguistic understanding in these writers that then helps them to generate explicit knowledge, which can be then internalized later. Originally, we thought that the explicit knowledge might well be simply making explicit that which is already implicit. So making it available for use. But increasingly, as we're particularly in this longitudinal study, we're realizing that for some learners, the implicit knowledge wasn't there. Particularly children who don't read much, because many of the patterns that we're looking at are patterns that we find in written text rather than in spoken language. And so sometimes we think that we are making implicit knowledge explicit, but sometimes we're giving explicit knowledge for the first time, which then becomes internalized. And we don't believe that when we write, we all sit there thinking, I will start my sentence with the subject and I will expand my noun phrase here, because we don't. But what we do think is that by making that knowledge explicit, children have a repertoire upon which to draw when they're dissatisfied with whether their writing is achieving the intentions that they want, or when they're trying to work out what they need to do. Again, with our professional writers, what's becoming really clear is the amount of, we've called it craft knowledge for our professional writers, but the explicit craft knowledge that they have is immense. They do talk explicitly about what they do, but they don't, equally, when they're writing, they don't explicitly think of all those things all the time. It's just when they're trying to either solve a problem or thinking about how to approach a task. And the other thing that our research does is look a lot at implementation. That's not just what works, but how is it working? Where is it not working? Why might it not be working, or why might it be working? So we look a lot at how teachers adopt the pedagogical approach and the various challenges that they face in doing so. So our research evidence so far, pretty much 6 studies that we've got, as well as some little mini studies you could say in between. So the one that started it was a large randomised controlled trial of about 750 students in secondary phase, 12 to 13-year-olds, which showed a significant positive effect. What it also showed was that it appeared to be a stronger effect for able writers than for our lower attaining writers, and that the effect was mediated by teachers' grammatical knowledge, which we'd predicted because we've got so many teachers in school who themselves weren't taught grammar. So clearly, if you're having to now teach grammar in this way, there's an issue there for you around the subject knowledge. So the second study actually picked up on that fact about the able writers to try and explore it a little more. In the data, what we had was the able writers in the control group made no progress over the year, which was an astonishing finding for the teachers who were teaching them. And then in the able writers in the intervention group made quite a good progress. But in the control group, the weaker writers did make some progress and made more progress in the intervention group. So we were concerned to find out, well, is it because this approach is too difficult for weaker writers, or is that gap simply a statistical phenomenon because there was no improvement in the able writers? So obviously the gap was bigger for able writers. So we did this, we looked at weaker writers, we looked at their writing, analysed what the weaknesses of their writing were in writing narrative, and designed a unit of work which pitched it at their needs, and it showed a positive effect. So we're reasonably confident that it's not about differing ability levels, it's actually about how you tailor what you're teaching to the learning needs of the children that you're working with. And the one difficulty, of course, of the randomised controlled trial is you've got very little sense of being able to tailor because it's all distant from you. And study 3 with older children was another one that picked up on what the teachers were telling us. The teachers were saying this seems to be having an effect on their reading comprehension as well. So we worked with the examination groups, GCSE in England, where there's an exam paper where the first question is a set of reading comprehension questions, and then the writing question usually uses the reading text as the stimulus for the writing example. And we were looking at, so we designed a unit of work around that paper and looked at the differences between pre and post. What that showed was that the questions in the reading comprehension that required them to comment on language use, language analysis, which are the ones that get the highest marks. So we've got literal comprehension, inferential comprehension, then the language analysis is the hierarchy for the way reading is marked in the UK, and it's the language analysis where they often struggle. It had a very strong positive effect on the language analysis, less on inferential and none at all on literal. So we were quite pleased by that because it kind of showed that the effect was where you might expect it. We also found that the effect was stronger on the reading than on the writing, which again is not surprising because writing is productive and reading is receptive up to a point. The reader makes the meaning. And then we did another 2 randomized controlled trials One with primary school, 9 to 10-year-old in primary, because of course we hadn't worked in primary, we'd only worked in secondary. And this was funded by a government offshoot, I don't know if that's the right word, a government-funded body that only funds randomised controlled trials, who very strangely get you to do the first half of the project, and then they have an evaluation team who do the evaluation. But what they did was actually, first of all, define the time at which we had to do the post-test, which was just after all the schools had just done their national tests. So there was massive, we said it's the wrong time to do it. And then the other thing they did was they chose so everything about our approach is about the teaching, the kind of writing. The grammar has to match the kind of writing that you're trying to improve. And the intervention was based on narrative writing. And then the test they chose was something descriptive about describing a box. So it had bore no relationship to what they'd been learning. But it did show a small positive effect. We constantly lobbied to get the test changed to be more meaningful. And bizarrely, they came back to us in November last year to ask us if we'd do it again. So we're now in the process, literally, of repeating that trial. And this time, the government has changed the national assessment. So we've got another test problem, which just kind of highlights some of the issues there are around some of these processes. They wanted to use the national test at age 11 as the post-test. Last year was the first year of a new test. When we were being interviewed for the funding, I said, it's a new test, it will be unreliable. And they said, no, it won't be. It can't be. The DFE, the Department for Education, says it will be wholly reliable. So we went along with it, and they've come back to us about 5 weeks ago to say, the results last year are too unreliable nationally to be used for comparison. We've got to think of another test. So we had to go back, we had to redo our ethics, go back, get consents again. So there are all sorts of issues around this that are frustrating. But we repeated it in the study 5 was almost with frustration at study 4. We repeated it regionally in the southwest. Exactly the same, except that the test of writing was a test of narrative, and it wasn't done just after national testing, and that had a positive effect. The effects are always small. I think effect sizes in education are often small. And then study 6, we moved away from the numbers because we got such a lot of data. A lot of these had qualitative studies attached to them. What we wanted to do was just do some really solid work looking at what does this look like as children develop, and what's the interrelationship between what the teachers do, what the teachers teach, and what the children learn. So we did a longitudinal study over 3 years, and that looked at 2 cohorts, children aged 9 through to 11, and then children aged 12 through to 14. So in effect, we had 6 years of schooling, but longitudinally it's two groups. And we were really looking there, well, okay, how do they develop this metalinguistic understanding? What about conceptual understanding of grammatical terminology? There's no research that I can find, so do tell me if you know any, that looks at how do children develop their concept knowledge of the idea of a verb, for example. But if you're trying to teach it, actually that's key knowledge, and we don't really have it. So we were looking at that, but we were also looking at their development of their knowledge of those choices and that link between the grammar and the writing, and what was the relationship between what they could talk about and what happened in their written texts themselves, and what was the relationship between what teachers did and what students learned. So just pausing at this point, sort of reflecting on this set of work, what would we say at this point is our collective wisdom, really, around this area? I think what we have got is multiple evidence that drawing attention to grammar meaning relationships at relevant points in the learning cycle, and we've looked at the teaching of writing, but I say we've got that study that shows there's also a link to reading, is an effective way to improve student outcomes. It does seem to be generalizable across multiple groups. So we've got quite good generalizability data, but there are factors which affect its success or otherwise, which is why we think from a teaching point of view, these bits are the most relevant, because it's what if you're actually working on professional development of teachers, what do you need to work on? One is that point that I've already made about teachers' grammatical subject knowledge, their foundational knowledge. One of the things that we've got in the longitudinal study is an absolute myriad of examples of teachers teaching things incorrectly. Not just not being able to cope with children's questions, but fundamental grammatical knowledge that they're teaching wrongly, mostly around sentence level and clauses. That's where it happens the most. The other thing that is linked to that, though, is that we would say that, you know, grammatical subject knowledge might be your academic content knowledge for teaching, but the pedagogical knowledge that you need is very much that capacity to notice how texts are working. And by texts, I mean both published texts, but also children's own writing as texts, so that you need to be able to notice what your children are doing in order to identify what they might need as the next steps. And then the other aspect, which you'll see more about when I talk about the pedagogical principles, is that we emphasize a lot high quality talk in our intervention, and teachers' confidence in managing that high quality talk is really significant. In some ways, I think we'd argue that the quality of the talk is the thing that is most linked to the extent to which children develop independence in their understanding. So that's, for us, really, really important. But we do feel, having done this longitudinal study, we feel that there is a lot more qualitative work now needed to develop this further. So I'm being very careful about the claims I'm making. I hope you pick that up. We're curious as researchers and want to know more about how things work rather than wanting to evangelise about a particular approach. The rest of the presentation is really quite practical until I get to the end, about helping you to understand the pedagogy, because I think that is the bit that, you know, I've told you all those things, and a lot of you are probably thinking, well, what does it actually mean? What does it really look like in practice? So I'm hoping that I'll be able to show you what it looks like in practice. And as I do so, it might be helpful for you to think about the books that your children read in Danish, Swedish and Norwegian. What are the young children's books? What are the books for primary schools? What are the secondary school books? So that you can think of whether there are parallel texts in your languages to the ones that I use. Because, of course, the one thing I don't know is whether the things that I'm drawing attention to linguistically work the same in Danish, Swedish and Norwegian. And obviously what you'd have to do is find examples that work in your text. So these are my examples are very much English-based. So what we stress when we talk about our approach, that the intervention, as it were, or the pedagogy, is that the relationship between grammar and writing is essentially a creative one. And we take great pride in trying to get in the word creative next to the word grammar. We were invited to write a grammar book for primary teachers that is just grammar knowledge, helps them develop their grammar knowledge. And the title we gave to the book was Creative Grammar for Creative Teachers. The publishers have called it Essential Primary Grammar. So we feel we failed dismally there. Well, they didn't want the word creative in there because it doesn't fit there, but we're very keen because genuinely we think what we're talking about is that creativity and how we use language. So what we're looking at is, as a teacher, asking yourself, what are the explicit grammatical points relevant to the learning about this kind of writing that I might teach? So if you're teaching a persuasive argument, what grammar might you highlight? If you're teaching fictional narrative, if you're teaching scientific writing, if you're teaching an instructional text, what grammar might you draw attention to? But crucially also asking the question, okay, for my class, for this group of learners, what do they need to know at this stage in their development about fictional narrative or instructional text or whatever? So it's not just the text, it's the writer's learning needs as well. And the goal of that, I've got competition from two geese. the goal is there to develop that understanding of the language choices that they can make in their own writing when they're approaching those texts. And that's where we see, that's where you get that repertoire of possibility. So we're not really interested in saying, if you're writing an instructional text, you should ... We're actually much more interested in saying, let's think about instructional texts. Let's look at some real examples of instructional texts and see what writers do. Look, those are the choices that those writers made. Which choices do you want to make? And there may be alternatives that those writers haven't used. So it's trying to get away from treating, well, certainly in England, we've had a genre approach to writing for quite a while, although the government's currently abandoned that as well. That has been a slight tendency with the way it's realised in schools, which is counter to the way genre pedagogy really intended it to happen, to actually teach genre in a very formulaic way, like a set of recipes for different texts. So the 4 key teaching principles that we try to get our teachers to really genuinely understand, and we had 7 to start with, and we thinned them down over successive studies to what we see as the 4 critical ones. The first one is that notion of making a link between the grammar that you're teaching and why you're teaching it in the context of that text. Not instructional text in general, but this instructional text that we're looking at here. So an example might be looking at past and present tense in newspaper reports for recount and comment. Now again, some of these things are going to be very English related, but in English schools where children write a lot of newspaper reports, what they show is very good knowledge of layout of newspaper text. So they will often do large headlines, they will often write in columns, they know about how headlines are structured, so they know about telegraphic writing for headlines, but when you look at the text, they often simply write a past tense narrative. But if you look at authentic newspapers, what they tend to do is to use past tense for the reportage, for the event that's being reported, but the present tense is the voice of the writer, the voice of the journalist, making comment on it. And that's what makes it a newspaper article. If it doesn't have the journalistic comment, it's not really an article, it's just a narrative in columns. The second one, and again this is because we cannot rely on the grammatical knowledge either in the children or in the teachers, is that the grammar is always explained through examples. So they see the model structures that we're talking about, and the appropriate metalinguistic terminology is used, but you don't divert the lesson into a little mini grammar lesson in order to make sure they've got grammatically understand that particular term. In our very first randomized controlled trial, the qualitative evaluation of it showed that some teachers got completely bogged down in a lesson with the grammatical explanations and kind of abandoned the teaching materials to do a lengthy lesson trying to teach the noun phrase, usually ending up in confusion on all sides. But the other reason, the reason for the lengthy explanations is because of that we saw that in the original study. Our current study, where we've been looking at conceptual understanding, is highlighting just how difficult grammatical explanations and definitions are, and actually showing structures and naming them may be a much better way to teach than trying to explain what a verb is, which is pretty impossible, and which English teachers then create their own versions of definitions that they think are accessible to young learners, which young learners pick up beautifully and use all their reasoning to reason why another word is a verb, for example, which isn't a verb, because they use semantic definitions. A classic one is the verb is a doing word. I think every class in England says a verb is a doing word, but actually the most common verbs appearing in an English text are to be and to have, because they act as auxiliaries. No children realise that to be and to have are verbs because they're not doing words. But even worse, if you've got a sentence like I like hunting, and you say to the children, what's the verb? Hunting is the verb because it's the doing word. And they'll even say it with things where it's less obvious, like he was a dream catcher. What's the verb? Dream catcher, because it tells us what he's doing. So you get these, so we think that increasingly we're looking at avoiding definitions and just showing structures and naming what they are and letting children learn through seeing them. So an example for this would be, I don't know if people know The Lord of the Flies. I apologise because they're all English books, but I clearly can't do it for Danish, Norwegian and Swedish. But The Lord of the Flies opens with a dystopic, a utopia and a dystopia together. So on a tropical island, desert island, paradise island, beautiful, but there's a plane crash that scars through the jungle. And it's a foreshadowing device that Golding uses for what happens later when it becomes, I mean, it's a dystopic novel in the end about how primitive humankind is. But he achieves the foreshadowing largely through his use of prepositional phrases in that opening to create the setting, because the prepositional phrases are either idyllic or they're dystopic. So you can just draw attention to that. And you don't need to get into prepositional phrases. You just give the children the prepositional phrases and say, here are the prepositional phrases that Golding uses. And you might just say, look, it's a preposition at the beginning of each one of these if you just wanted to point something out. Then there's this issue of talk, which, as I said, we've got quite a lot of research now where quite a lot of articles that are just about the talk, the nature of the talk. And it ties in a lot with the notion of monologic and dialogic talk. And if teachers make it very monologic, where what they're trying to do is get the children to simply name where the noun phrase is, or to say what the noun phrase is doing with a right answer for what the noun phrase is doing, children are not picking up any real understanding from it. But where the teachers are really opening up the discussion about, well, what's happening here? Which version do you think is most effective? Why do you think that writer chose to end with a question, whereas that writer chose to end with a statement? So where it becomes much more open-ended discussion, that's when the children are developing much more independent knowledge. It's also, of course, where the children come up with answers that the teacher didn't think of, which is part of the whole point of this kind of talk. So, and then finally, we only ever use real texts, authentic texts from the authentic world, because in grammar books often invent texts to exemplify points, which often have constructions that are grammatically correct, but you'd never really use in English. One of the grammar tests that the 11-year-olds showed them how to make a passive before asking them how to make a passive, and had something like, Ben ate the biscuit was eaten by Ben. It's perfectly correct, but it's really hard to think of a situation in English where you would say the biscuit was eaten by Ben. Perhaps in a crime, who did it? Oh, the biscuit was eaten by Ben. But even then you'd probably say it was Ben. So, and the other thing is that, again, it links to our own particular context, where we've had quite a lot of emphasis on teacher modelling, which has been a really good thing. Teacher modelling of writing. What sometimes happens is teachers write a text in order to model a particular point that they want to make, and they're often really artificial texts. We had one teacher in our longitudinal study who wanted to do a persuasive letter to a head teacher, get the children writing a persuasive letter to the head teacher. And one of our first questions to the teachers was, okay then, so what's your model text? What's the mentor text that you're going to be using? And she said, well, I couldn't find one, so I've written one. At which, the alarm bells go, and I said, let's have a look at it then. And what she really wanted to teach them was sequencing of argument through a text. So her letter to the head teacher sort of had the opening paragraph, and then it said, firstly, secondly, thirdly, finally, which of course is absolutely fine, but can you find an authentic text out there which does anything that literally? You tend to be firstly, another reason, furthermore, finally, or in conclusion. There are all sorts of different ways of doing it. So we abandoned that, and instead I went to look. I said, I'll find you a model text. And thought, there must be hundreds of letters written to head teachers that I can find, and discovered on the internet, as you do, that there are loads of model examples, but they're nearly all advice to parents on how to write stroppy letters to the head teachers that are appropriate for children to write to head teachers, because the way they're structured, there's a different power relationship between a parent and a head teacher than a child and a head teacher. So she really gave me a problem. And actually we talked about it a bit more and realised actually the letter was simply the format of the text. It was the structure of persuasive writing that she was really after. So we used a World Wildlife Fund campaign leaflet, which had very strong sequencing of ideas, but didn't do it quite as heavy-handedly as firstly, secondly, thirdly, finally. And so she used that. Oops, I think I've gone too far. So this is just, I've got 2 slides, so I'm going to try and represent it to you in terms of, you know, how you link the writing and the grammar. So here, and these are all real examples from classes that we've worked with. The focus was writing a science text. In primary, of course, they're often looking at writing across the disciplines. In secondary English, the only is literary critical writing if it's is the main thing that they're looking at. But in primary, which this was, they were looking at writing like a scientist. And the grammar focus in this particular lesson was on the way adverbials were working to add precision in an information or an explanation text, to add the detail. And the authentic example came from this children's encyclopedia. And then you can see there the underlined adverbials are all giving more information and more, you know, they push, pull and wrestle, but they do it with their arms, not their legs. When you're a kangaroo, they do the kangaroo boxing, don't they? And they kick out with their great feet and they use their strong tail for support, and they're battling for females at breeding time. So a lot of the scientific information there really comes in the prepositional phrases. Without the prepositional phrases, all you really know is that they push, pull and wrestle and may kick out. So you get all the detail in the prepositional phrases. So there, the link, talking about adverbials, has a clear purpose in the context of that lesson for what that teacher wanted them to learn about science texts. And then moving to persuasive writing, and this is from older students, this is secondary, looking at the way in which abstract nouns in English, again, interesting if you keep thinking, does this work in Norwegian, Swedish and Danish, how abstract nouns carry all the weight of ideas in a persuasive argument. And this is from Malala Yousafzai's speech to the UN, and again, underline the abstract nouns. A lot of the power of the ideas are packed into those abstract nouns. Aims, ambitions, weakness, fear, hopelessness, strength, power, courage, ambitions, hopes, dreams. It's very, very heavily packed. And in English, the shift from an adjective to an abstract noun often signals an increase of formality and an increase of weight. So she could have, a lot of that could have been rewritten with adjectives. So you could have had weak, frightened, hopeless, instead of weakness, fear, hopelessness. But that change to abstract nouns increases the weight of, and the authority, actually, of the argument. And so again, the teacher is picking abstract nouns because of the link, the learning point she wants to make in that lesson. And now I'm going to go on and give you some more examples from different classes, different texts. So this is in a sequence of learning about fictional narrative, where they actually write their own Arthurian legend. So it's a story about King Arthur and Merlin. And one strand of it is looking at character development and looking particularly at how noun phrases are very powerful in creating either visual descriptions of characters or details about characters which make the reader infer. So sometimes those visual descriptions are literal, they're just to help you picture or visualize the character, but also quite often in narrative, the choices you make in how you describe your character make you infer something about the nature of that character. So these were all noun phrases about Merlin, the characters in Merlin, that were taken from the text that we were using, which is Michael Morpurgo, children's author's text. And then they looked at this image, which actually was taken from a television series that we had about Merlin that lots of the children knew about. We remind them of the structure of the noun phrases and then got them to try and write noun phrases which create a visual description of that character. And what we were really trying to get them to do was to understand that notion of transfer from the visual to the verbal. And one of the things that we'd also discovered looking at weaker writers' writing is that their understanding of narrative is often heavily driven by their engagement with visual texts, largely computer text, videos, or even gaming and the narrative that goes on in gaming. And often they're very good at interpreting the meaning of visual texts. We've got one example of a single frame from a Bart Simpson comic where there's a teacher with the class and Bart Simpson's there with some of his friends and the teacher's sitting on the desk. And it's really, you look at that image and you can tell from that image that the teacher's grumpy, that the teacher doesn't like being there, that they don't particularly like the teacher, that the teacher, who are the good children in the class and who are the naughty children in the class. All of that information is there in the way it's visually represented. If you ask children to say, tell me about that frame, what's happening there, they will say the teacher's setting the class homework. That's the narrative event. If you question them about all those things about the teacher and the children, they have picked up all of that inference. What they don't do when they write is do that same transfer into the verbal. They often simply do the narrative event and they don't do any of the colour, the detail. So this was focusing a lot on how do you transfer from visual to verbal. And that then is a lot about precision and choice of words. We have another tendency in England to encourage children to improve their writing by adding better adjectives. And better is a qualitative word that simply means ones that other people haven't thought of. So you get ridiculous things like the jade green grass fluttered in the wind, and you think, well, where do you see jade green grass? And so this is trying to get at the idea of if you're creating a noun phrase, every word works for you, but you have to make the right choices. And then this one, moving on to a different text, this was from primary. They were working on, it was actually the same lesson as we had with the kangaroos earlier. They've got this book, which is a wonderful, beautifully written book, which is a dual text, where it tells the life cycle of an eel. And part of it is a scientific version of the life cycle of an eel, and the other bit of it is a poetic version or a lyrical kind of narrative description of the life cycle of the eel, which makes it a wonderful text for looking at the choices that you make, because actually the message is the same in both versions, but how the message is conveyed is different because your purpose and your audience are different. You're trying to do different things. So they were looking at this science text, and here we've got some examples. So you've got some lovely contrasts. So the top bit, around a drowned oak stump, through twisting green weeds, a mud hole is hidden. But the scientific version is mud holes, burrows, and cracks in the riverbed are all homes for eels. So it's the same information. But the poetic text, you've got the main clause is delayed, so it's at the end of the sentence, a mud hole is hidden. You've got two foregrounded prepositional phrases, around a drowned oak stump, through twisting green weeds, and you've got descriptive detail. You've got stump, drowned, twisting. But the scientific text, it's shorter, but it's the subject start to the sentence, which is much more direct. I'm telling you about mud holes, burrows, and cracks. And actually the subject is slightly more detailed than just the mud hole. It's mud holes, burrows, and cracks. So even there's more precision. And the prepositional phrase, in the riverbed, is not about descriptive detail, about drowning or twisting. It's actually about precise information about where it's happening. And then another example from the same book. So you've got this long lyrical description of the end point, really, of this poor male eel's life. There's eel tomb and eel cradle in the weedy Sargasso Sea. After 80 days swimming, not eating, not sleeping, eel's long winding body is worn out and wasted. He spills the new life carried deep in his belly, then sinks through the sea like a used silver wrapper. And then the scientific version, the male eel's sperm fertilizes the female's eggs in the water. And it's not it's perfectly good scientific writing. It's just more direct and to the point. And you can look at the differences. The poetic text tends to have longer sentences, lots of use of metaphor and simile, expanded noun phrases. The noun phrases are longer, much more emotive engagement with the subject through those words like worn out and through the similes and metaphors. More indirect communication. Actually, in order to work out what's happening, you have to be a much better reader to read the lyrical text. Do you get what the writer's talking about when they're talking about eel tomb and eel cradle? That's not direct. And just in case you're not too good on the sex life of eels, what happens is the blokes, all the eels live in the rivers in England, and in Europe, and they have to swim across the sea to the Sargasso Sea for breeding. So the male eel spends most of his life in the rivers in England, but then when it's his time to be productive, he has to swim all the way across the sea, gets exhausted, fertilises the eggs and then dies. And so that eel tomb and eel cradle relies on you understanding that here in the Sargasso Sea, it's the death of eels, but it's also the birthplace of eels. And that's quite complex. And even things like he spills the new life carried deep in his belly. That still needs you to understand. What does he mean by spilling? What does he mean by new life? Whereas the scientific text is shorter sentences, again, a subject start. It's got an expanded noun phrase, but it provides scientific detail. The male eel's sperm. So it's detail about the science, uses scientific vocabulary, male sperm, fertilizes, female's eggs, and there's more direct communication and less inference required. So it's trying to make sure that the reader understands far more than the other one is trying to make sure the reader understands the science. You could ask, what is it the writer wants the reader to understand in the top one? I think it's much more of an emotional engagement with the story that the writer wants there. And you can have a lovely discussion about, I'll show you that on the next one, because it's what they then did. So one of the tasks the teacher did with this book was to look at two different points in the story, in the lyrical bit of the story, the poetic bit. The first bit is taken from early on when the male eel is just getting ready to do the journey across the Sargasso Sea, and she writes about the eel at that point. Into the river he swims like a mad thing. He wriggles up rapids, climbs rocks around waterfalls. Riverbanks guide him, nothing will stop him. And then later is the bit that you've just heard on the previous page, the longer version. And she asked the children to talk about what's the difference between those two in terms of the variety in sentence structure. And she prompts them to think about, we could look at sentence length and shortness, you could look at syntax, where the information is in the sentence, or you could look at the literary devices, because it was a poetic text. Am I getting myself tangled up? And so they have a lot of conversations about what the effect of the short sentences are. And this is back to this notion that there aren't necessarily single right answers to this, because some children talk about it creates a sense of urgency. It tells us that he's keen to go. It's very full of pace, full of a sense of drive. And then the second one, they'll often talk about the length of the sentences reflects the mood of the eel, that he's tired. The sentences are long and winding, just like his journey across the sea has been. So they have that discussion about the difference between the two and draw out what some of those differences are. And then the teacher asks them to rewrite that 80 Days Swimming as a science text. Now, you already know what Karen Wallace, the author, did, because we were looking at it earlier. I'm just going to give you a minute or so, though, in pairs around the room to have a go yourself. If you were rewriting that as a science text, how would you write it? You can write it in your own language if you wish to, so you don't have to do it in English. But if you were changing that from a lyrical text to a science text, and you want to include the same broad information, but and I think you know enough now about the sex life of eels for me to be confident that you can do it. Okay, so, but I want you to do it in pairs, because I want you talking about it. Okay? Okay. Okay.
Eller om vi kan stoppa det sammanhängande utan att vara.
Okay, now what I want you to do is I want you to verbalize to each other the choices you've made and why you've made them. What have you actually done in transforming that text? Okay? Okay.
It's too interesting for them.
Hello. Okay, I'll stop you now. So you must be highly engaged. And I'm not giving you long enough, of course, but in some ways what I've done is show you some of the ways in which this approach can work. And you noticed in both of those activities you had to talk. One of the things we do quite a lot is get children to co-create a text or co-create a part of a text, because that joint composition means you have to verbalize your decision making in a way that you don't do if you're writing yourself, and that can be really useful. And then also the other thing is I asked you to verbalise the choices that you'd made. So actually to explain and discuss, well, why have you done it? So that's trying to draw out that explicitness. So one version of that, and of course there's multiple versions of this that you could use. And you could also discuss Karen Wallace's version where she, if we go back, she doesn't tell you anything about the 80 days or anything. She just, the male eel's sperm fertilizes the female's eggs in the water. But we didn't want, I deliberately didn't choose Karen Wallace's version for this because you just wanted to open it up, that idea. There are multiple versions. That's what she's done. We've read that. But what would you do? What would you do? And so this is just one example that one child came up with. And then you can have a really good discussion about what transformations are made to alter that lyrical description into scientific description. Could other changes be made? So some children feel very much that you don't need the without food or sleep. You can take that out, that it's implicit or it's not particularly relevant. Some children think the after 80 days swimming needs to be further into the sentence. In fact, if you're going to mention the time, it has to be first, pretty much, because it's in a sequence. But you can have really interesting discussions. And of course, one of the oddest things, and again, don't know if this works the same in your languages, but in the first version, which is the lyrical description, it says eel's long winding body. In the scientific version, it talks about the eel. But it's the first one that's talking about one particular eel. In other words, you'd think the definite article might apply to the eel in the first story. The second one, the eel, is not referring to one eel. It's referring to eels in general. And it's a scientific way of writing in English. You use the present tense and you use universal the to apply to all eels. So who would ever have thought you could have an interesting language discussion about the word the? But you can. And it was a child that pointed that out. Not the teacher or me, because we hadn't noticed it. And that's one of the things that's really interesting about if you really open up discussion, actually things get pointed out that you hadn't noticed because you were too busy looking at the things you'd already decided you were going to look at. So just pulling this to a close, there are all sorts of other things that you can do. Quite a lot of the things that I pick link to things where we know we've got issues in school at the moment. So our children are discouraged from using and. That using and too much is a problem, because it can well be. So in English, lots of children simply chain lots and lots of ideas with and, without actually shaping the sentence in a way that's much more effective. But it kind of creates a sense that and is a banned word, rather than that using it inappropriately is what you should avoid. And if you look at texts, there are all sorts of ways in which and is used really creatively. So this is just from Roald Dahl's, a Norwegian. I'd forgotten that. Roald Dahl's BFG, which is hugely popular. I mean, Roald Dahl is just hugely popular as a children's author still. And he is a most creative writer of narrative. And look at all the different ways he uses and. They punched and kicked and scratched and bit and butted each other as hard as they could. And you could have a discussion about, well, if he'd used commas instead of the ands, what would have changed about that sentence? Why might he have chosen to put in those ands? Because actually what they do is they emphasise the accumulation of it all rather than focusing on the action itself. And then you've got this lovely sort of pattern. He rolled and he wiggled, he fought and he figgled, he squirmed and he squiggled. Again, a creative use of and. Then you've got the pattern of three. The giants roared and screamed and cursed. And for many minutes the noise of battle rolled across the plains. He took a deep breath, puffed out his cheeks, and then woof. And then this last pattern, this is another pattern that's really common, well, not common, but is used a lot in narrative in English to describe a narrative sequence where you have the comma to replace the first and. So it's three clauses, three coordinated clauses. They stood up, stretched their limbs, and started leaping. So it's comma and then an and the subject is only at the beginning of the first clause. So the they covers all three verbs. So it's a very economic way of describing a narrative sequence. And so you could have a conversation about those. One of our discoveries in the longitudinal study that I mentioned earlier was this major problem with teachers around clauses and verbs. And we got to what we did throughout the 3 years was interview children about their writing, about what they thought their teachers were teaching them for this piece of writing, and where had they done that then in their text, which as a way of eliciting what's actually happening is incredibly illuminative. But we got to the point at the end of year 2 where we were also asking them, we had cards on the table with different grammatical terms and different sentence types, and we were asking them about those, and we got to the point at the end of 2 years, both in the primary and the secondary samples, where children were still saying the same things about verbs and about clauses that they were saying at the beginning of the study. So no progress at all. So what we did was intervene with the teachers and say, well, we think the real problem is they're all talking about clauses, but nobody ever talks to them about a verb being the key thing that determines a clause. There are all sorts of proxies for clauses, like it comes at the front of a sentence and it's got a comma after it, or it's additional information that you can take out. So they identify prepositional phrases as clauses because you can take them out and put them in. So we actually said, let's teach children this year that the verb is at the heart of a clause and see if we can improve their understanding of the clause, which it did do. But one of the teachers took this structure that was in a different narrative. So the mental text was a story about a snow leopard in the Himalayas. And again, it was a kind of mythical story about reincarnation. And it's about a little girl in this Himalayan valley, and the snow leopard's coming to the end of its time, and the little girl then becomes the snow leopard and takes over looking after the valley thereafter. It's a fictional narrative, and what she was looking at as this notion of this pattern of those 3 coordinated clauses with the comma and how it can describe a sequence of actions in a narrative event and create a rhythm at that plot moment. And so these are 2 examples from the authentic text, from the story. The cat stirred, rose and leapt up to the high wild mountains, and then later the young snow leopard looked up at the stars mirrored in her blue cat's eyes, heard the whisper and began a new song. So again, same structure, slightly differently done, but it's there as the same structure. So she taught them that. And then the transfer of learning into their writing, what they did was so this was a Himalayan story, in science they were looking at rainforests. So what they did was they were writing their own fictional narrative about a creature in the rainforest who was acting as some form of guardian, and there was this kind of reincarnation idea. So Izzy, one of the able writers, you can see that she chose a golden lion tamarin, and she writes, she wrapped the tree in loving leaves, crowded creatures onto the tropical trees, and gave the plants the sun and water they needed. So she's used that pattern. It's a kind of creation story as well. As you can tell, this is where she's creating. But then Harry, who is a weak writer, who really did not write, you might say, well, okay, the able writer might have been able to do that anyway. The weaker writer, who really did not write very well, he manages to use it as well. The bald eagle raced to create the wind, soared through the secret forest to awaken all animals, and squawked over the green ocean canopy to make the mystical mist. So you can see that the pattern is taken into both of their texts. And in fact, Harry did it twice. He's got another example of it elsewhere. And here, so we've got Izzy talking about the sentence that you've seen in the text before when we were interviewing her. We said to you, what was the teacher trying to get you to do in this text? What were the choices that you had? What have you chosen to do? And she says, you can put like 3 words, like adjectives or adverbs, and then you can do it as 3 subjects. Like, she wrapped the trees in loving leaves, crowded creatures onto the tropical trees, and gave the plants the sun they need. We were taught how to do power of 3, like 3 words in year 5, that's 2 years earlier. But then we were taught how to do that's Devon, how to do them more harder versions, like clauses, 3 clauses. So even though she hasn't explained it brilliantly, she knows she was looking at 3 clauses in a pattern of 3. And she can refer to her own example of where she's used it. But then when you look at how she describes its effect, remember she's only age 10 or 11, she's able to talk about her choice, but she's still talking more about the semantic meaning than the effect that it creates. It shows how peaceful and loving the monkey is. So she wrapped the trees. It's like when you feel ill, you're wrapping yourself in your duvet. So the trees were wrapped in loving leaves. So she's not actually talking about how the effect of the pattern of the 3 clauses, what that does. She's really talking about the choice of the content she's got there. And this we see as one of the patterns of transfer, is that sometimes children can be explicit about what the target structure was and find it, but less confident in articulating it. But Harry is a different kind of story. So this was his other example of it. He does have explicit understanding of the target structure, but can't use the grammatical metalanguage. So he doesn't mention clauses or verbs at all. And he said, we were trying to do a pattern of 3. So where's your pattern of 3? You've got a pattern of 3, because he's found this sense. What are they? And he says he squawked, tightened his talons, and soared through the sky. So he picks the 3 clauses. So he does have some metalinguistic understanding, but not the grammatical terminology. But what he doesn't have is he cannot talk at all about the effect of the choice in his own writing. So no comments. And one of the things that we're now beginning to think about patterns of transfer is that they are not linear. So our curriculum assumes that if you teach children about particular grammatical structures, they will learn the structure, they will then apply it in their writing. We're actually finding lots of children applying something in their writing when they don't yet have the explicit metalinguistic knowledge of it, or like this, where they've got some knowledge of what the choice they've made, but not able to verbalise the effects. So we think it's a much more interactive, complex relationship between understanding and transfer into writing than a very straight, you teach it to them, they understand it, they use it in their writing, which probably no teacher will be surprised at, but clearly our curriculum designers are. You've probably picked up that our curriculum is mad, along with other things to do with our country at present. So, pulling this all together, just reiterating that idea of the pattern of looking at the texts you're teaching to work out what grammatical structures they have that you might teach, but also thinking about what children might need to learn, about embedding that into your teaching units with the hope that that will then develop this metalinguistic understanding. And that notion that that metalinguistic understanding is realised in many complex ways, not simply in linear transfer into writing. So our theoretical conclusions then, we would argue that this explicit teaching of grammar, which is making those connections, is developing metalinguistic understanding about writing. But also that the idea of metalinguistic understanding about writing is a very rich set of complex learning, not just reproductive knowledge that you echo back from the teacher. That a view of grammar as choice is trying to help children to break free in a way of very formulaic, rote patterns of learning. The idea that they are transforming ideas, transforming when they create text, rather than simply reproducing a particular kind of text. And what our evidence is showing is that this approach is effective, but it comes with those caveats. That teaching is a highly complex activity. In any lesson, when you're working with children, there are 1,000,001 decisions that a teacher is making every step of the way. And particularly the grammatical subject knowledge influences the decision making that teachers make in those moments. And also the other one is that capacity to manage dialogic metalinguistic talk. So the 2 key things that we're constantly working on is that core knowledge for the teachers about the grammar and understanding texts, but also that one about metalinguistic talk and how you verbalise it and how you open up decision making. And if you wanted to see any of the resources that we've produced, there's some there, because you can have the PowerPoint after this, and some of the articles that kind of tap into some of those things are there if you want to see them. So I'll stop there and take questions.